Are Dungeons and Dragons and other fantasy role-playing games unrealistic and not something that could actually happen in the real world? It's a common criticism. But when you start looking at ancient underground cities, sprawling cave systems, and forgotten ruins reclaimed by time in the real world, that argument begins to quickly fall apart. And I'm going to prove it to you with actual examples of dungeons in the real world, coming right up on RPG Retro Reviews. Hello everyone, I'm Captain Courageous and I review old school modules and games and try to give them a fun and informative analysis, but this week I'm doing something a little bit different. Instead of just diving into a classic adventure, what I want to do is tackle a question that comes up all the time on forums, group discussions, and sometimes just at your gaming table. Are Dungeons and Dragons and fantasy role-playing games actually unrealistic in their depiction of trap-filled labyrinths and cave complexes? Who designed these things anyway? Sounds crazy, and on the surface it might seem that way. Twisting corridors, underground complexes, monsters lurking in the dark. How do all those monsters fit into that space anyway? But when you start looking at real-world history, ancient structures, and even natural cave systems, a very different picture starts to emerge. So today, we're going to break that idea down and take a look at why dungeons don't just work in fantasy, they actually make a lot more sense than you might think. But first, what are dungeons without dice? As gamers, we all love dice. Certainly there's a dice goblin at your table with a vast collection of unique and amazing dice sets. It's the randomness of dice that partly determines the fate of your adventures, and that gives them a kind of magical power. Let me introduce you to Dice Nest. Dice Nest is a unique crafter of high-quality polyhedral dice who don't simply make dice for your fantastical games, but nurtures those stories and your imagination through the beauty of their creations. There is the Crimson Bloom set with a real preserved flower within each die, frozen in time like a moment of passion made eternal. The Arcane Gateway dice series are engraved with mystic runes and crafted from genuine precious stones like Xiu Jade. These dice seem to carry the power of ancient spells, ready to transport you into a world of fantasy and mystery. Or my personal favorite, the Prismatic Radiance dice cut from K9 prismatic glass in a unique, multifaceted method. The light dazzles and refracts hypnotically in a spectrum of color. The pictures here just don't do these justice. Dice Nest was kind enough to actually send these to me, and when I showed them to my players, they were just blown away. There is a vast array of dice sets at Dice Nest's website that is sure to appeal to your inner dice goblin. And thanks to this collaboration with Dice Nest, you can save 15% off your purchase when you enter Captain Courageous at checkout. Add to the magic of the gaming experience at your table with Dice Nest today, and game on. Thank you, Dice Nest. There is a persistent line of criticism that fantasy dungeons simply would not exist in any practical or realistic sense. The core of this argument is that such structures are inherently inefficient, overly complex, difficult to navigate, and lacking any clear functional purpose. Rather than being designed with real-world needs in mind, they are often described as artificial constructs, built purely to challenge intruders. In this view, the dungeon is not architecture at all, but a game mechanic, an enclosed space that conveniently funnels movement, controls encounters, and simplifies exploration in a way that real environments rarely do. A related critique focuses on the impracticality of constructing and maintaining underground spaces, particularly in a pre-industrial context. Excavation on that scale would require immense labor, and the resulting environment would be difficult to inhabit. But all of these arguments pretty much fall to pieces when you learn about the Derinkayu underground city in the Cappadocia region of Turkey. The Derinkayu underground city is one of the most compelling real-world dungeons because it was literally designed as a multi-level survival complex beneath the earth. Carved into soft volcanic rock, it descends roughly 60 meters, 200 feet, and could shelter thousands of people along with livestock, food stores, and water supplies. Its purpose wasn't symbolic or ceremonial, it was practical: protection from invasion. Its earliest origins likely date back to the Phrygians around the 8th to 7th century BCE, who began carving into the soft volcanic rock of the region. However, what we see today, the vast multi-level complex, was expanded significantly during the Byzantine period, roughly the 4th to the 15th century CE. During that time, it was enlarged and refined into a massive refuge capable of sheltering thousands of people, particularly as protection from invasions and raids. What makes Derinkayu feel like something out of a tabletop module is its intentional layout complexity. Narrow corridors force single-file movement. Massive rolling stone doors conceal entire sections, and ventilation shafts double as wells. This is defensive architecture designed to slow intruders and give residents the advantage. Exactly the logic behind dungeon choke points and trap-like environments. But there's also a strong sense of vertical progression, a hallmark of dungeon design. Different levels serve different purposes: living quarters, storage, religious spaces, and even wineries. The deeper you go, the more specialized and isolated the spaces become. That layered design mirrors how RPG dungeons escalate in difficulty and importance as players descend. In short, Derinkayu proves that the idea of a sprawling, interconnected underground complex isn't fantasy at all. It's a direct response to real human needs: defense, secrecy, and survival under a threat. All of this constructed well before industrialization. It was a long-term, evolving project built and expanded over centuries as needs changed. Another detail that lines up surprisingly well with how the history of fantasy dungeons are often described. Next up, let's talk tombs, and not just any tomb, but a vast labyrinthine place full of twisting passages, traps, and corridors. I'm talking about the Saqqara necropolis in Egypt. The Saqqara necropolis is less about survival like Derinkayu and more about ritual, death, and protection of the sacred, but it's still unmistakably dungeon-like. This vast burial complex includes the famous step pyramid of Djoser, surrounded by a network of underground chambers, corridors, and sealed rooms numbering over 400, a real-world mega-dungeon. These tombs were deliberately constructed as maze-like environments to deter grave robbers. False passages, sealed chambers, and hidden burial rooms created confusion and delay, essentially functioning as passive traps. The goal wasn't just to hide treasure, but to protect the journey of the dead into the afterlife, making intrusion both physically difficult and spiritually dangerous. There's also a thematic element that aligns perfectly with dungeon design. The deeper you go, the more sacred and dangerous the space becomes. Surface-level structures are monumental and ceremonial, but beneath them lie the true heart of the complex: burial chambers filled with artifacts, symbolism, and in many cases, curses or warnings meant to ward off intruders. Saqqara shows that dungeons don't have to be about monsters and combat. They can be about meaning, protection, and controlled access to powerful or forbidden spaces, which is arguably even closer to how many classic RPG dungeons are structured. Moving above ground, let's talk about one of my personal favorite architectural wonders of the world, the lost Incan city of Machu Picchu. At first glance, Machu Picchu doesn't scream dungeon. It's open air, scenic, and majestic. But structurally, it shares a lot with dungeon logic: controlled pathways, layered access, and restricted zones tied to status and function. The citadel is built with a clear sense of projection and gating. Movement through the site isn't random. It's guided by stairways, terraces, and narrow paths that funnel people through specific routes. Certain areas like temples or royal residences were restricted, creating a hierarchy of access that mirrors how dungeon rooms are often locked behind progression. There's also a defensive and strategic element. Built high in the Andes, Machu Picchu is naturally protected by steep cliffs and limited entry points. Anyone approaching the site would be funneled into predictable routes, exactly the kind of environmental control dungeon designers use to create tension and challenge. Next up, of course, is the Paris catacombs in France. The Paris catacombs are about as close as you can get to a literal undead dungeon in the real world. Originally limestone quarries, they were repurposed in the late 18th century to house the remains of millions of Parisians when cemeteries became overcrowded. The result is a vast, disorienting labyrinth of tunnels, many of which remain off-limits or poorly mapped. Unlike carefully planned cities or citadels, the catacombs evolved over time, creating a chaotic network of passages that can easily confuse and trap the unwary. Exactly the feeling dungeon crawls tried to evoke. However, what really sells the comparison in this case and makes it so compelling is the atmosphere. Walls of stacked bones, dim lighting, and the oppressive underground environment create a sense of unease that feels straight out of the Tomb of Horrors. This isn't just a functional space, it's a spiritual one, whether intentional or not. The catacombs highlight an important truth. Not all dungeons are designed that way from the start. Some emerge organically from layers of history, repurposing, and human necessity, resulting in spaces that are just as complex and dangerous as anything imagined in a fantasy game module. Lastly, as far as human-made structural examples, let's take a look at the Edinburgh Castle vaults in Scotland. Beneath Edinburgh Castle lies a network of vaults and chambers that were used for storage, military purposes, and imprisonment. These spaces are closest to the traditional image of a dungeon, complete with stone walls, confined spaces, and a history of human suffering. Unlike a sprawling underground necropolis, these vaults are more contained, but that doesn't make them simple. They're part of a larger defensive structure integrated into the castle's design to support its function as a fortress. Movement is restricted, visibility is limited, and control is absolute. Perfect conditions for both defense and detention. Historically, such spaces were used to hold prisoners of war, criminals, and political enemies. The architecture reflects that purpose: secure, isolating, and difficult to escape. In many cases, these chambers were deliberately uncomfortable or even brutal, reinforcing their role as instruments of control. This example ties directly into classic fantasy tropes. When players imagine a dungeon, they're often picturing exactly this kind of environment because it's rooted in real-world practices of imprisonment and fortification. So far, I've only mentioned human-made edifices and structures. But what about the Underdark? Surely that's completely ridiculous, and there's no real-world justification for that. Well, not so fast. As is sometimes the case, truth is stranger than fiction. Let's take a look at several real-world examples of natural formations that demonstrate that such things are indeed possible. First up is Mammoth Cave National Park in Kentucky. The Mammoth Cave National Park is the longest known cave system in the world, with over 400 miles of explored passageways, and that number continues to grow. What makes Mammoth Cave particularly compelling is not just its size, but its complex, multi-layered structure with tunnels stacked one on top of the other across different elevations. These layers were formed over millions of years as water carved through limestone, creating dry upper passages and active lower levels where underground rivers still flow. This creates a natural sense of vertical progression where different levels of the cave have distinct environmental conditions, some dry and dusty, others wet, muddy, and actively changing. Biologically, Mammoth Cave is home to a variety of diverse and highly specialized life forms, including blind fish, cave shrimp, and insects that have adapted to total darkness. Thus, here we can see that even isolated subterranean environments naturally produce strange, unique ecosystems. In a fantasy setting, it's not a stretch at all to imagine that these same processes, given the strange and often gigantic versions of real-world animals, make for very dangerous inhabitants and mimics real-world ecology. In the Guadalupe Mountains of southeastern New Mexico, there is Carlsbad Caverns National Park, which offers a different but equally important perspective, scale, and spectacle. The famous Big Room is over 4,000 feet long and large enough to fit multiple football fields inside of it. This isn't a cramped tunnel system. It's a vast, open underground world. Formed by sulfuric acid dissolving limestone, Carlsbad Cavern features enormous chambers filled with towering stalagmites and delicate stalactites and other formations that feel almost alien. These natural structures create terrain features that would function exactly like dungeon hazards or landmarks, columns, choke points, natural bridges, and vertical drops. The caverns are also home to a massive bat population, which introduces another key concept, resource cycles. The bats bring nutrients into the cave system, which supports entire food chains below. Even in a relatively barren environment, life finds a way to establish itself through available resources. Translate that into a fantasy setting, and you can easily justify entire underground ecosystems supported by unusual energy sources, whether that's magical radiation, geothermal heat, or strange fungi forests, again reinforcing the logic of an Underdark-style environment. Traveling around the world to Vietnam, we find the Hang Son Dong, which is perhaps the most fantasy-looking cave system on Earth, and it barely needs any exaggeration at all. It is the largest known cave passage in the world, with sections so vast that they contain their own weather systems and microclimates, rivers, and even jungles. Its immense size stretches over 9 kilometers, with some chambers up to 200 meters high. The caves form clouds and mists and even localized rain inside the caves. What sets Son Dong apart are its massive collapses in the ceiling, called dolines, which allow sunlight to pour into the cave. These openings have created fully functioning ecosystems inside the cavern, complete with trees, plants, and animals. You're not just underground, you're in a hidden world, completely separate from that of the surface. This is where the Underdark comparison becomes almost unavoidable. This cave demonstrates that underground spaces can be self-contained environments with their own climates, geography, and life cycles. It's not just tunnels, it's a subterranean landscape. In a fantasy context, remove the need for sunlight and replace it with magical or geothermal energy, and you suddenly have a believable explanation for vast underground civilization, forests of fungi, and entire ecosystems that exist far beneath the surface world. And if you think all of this sounds a little far-fetched, consider the fact that people are still exploring these kinds of places today. Entire communities of so-called urban explorers dedicate themselves to seeking out abandoned hospitals, forgotten factories, decaying mansions, mines, tunnels, old shopping malls, and other places long since reclaimed by time. Channels like The Proper People have documented countless expeditions into crumbling insane asylums, abandoned schools, theaters, churches, and industrial facilities. What is fascinating isn't just the locations themselves, but the sense of discovery they evoke. These explorers rarely know exactly what they'll find around the next corner. Every room tells a story. A child's toy left on a windowsill, old paperwork scattered across a desk, peeling movie posters still hanging on a theater wall, small glimpses into lives that once unfolded there. For a brief moment, you find yourself wondering who these people were, what their days were like, and what ultimately caused them to leave it all behind. The echoes of those lives still linger in the silence. A coat hangs where it was last placed. A desk remains uncovered in papers. A chair sits empty beside a window. These places feel less abandoned than interrupted, as though life simply paused one day and never resumed. There is a quiet sadness in that realization, a sense that countless stories were left unfinished, waiting for someone to remember they were ever told. The same can be said for cave exploration. Watch expeditions by groups like the Action Adventure Twins. It's difficult not to be reminded of a classic fantasy adventure crawling through narrow passages barely large enough for a person to squeeze through, descending into vast chambers untouched by sunlight, navigating underground rivers and sheer drops with little more than ropes and determination. It is adventure in its purest form. Unlike a marked hiking trail, these environments can be dangerous, unpredictable, and completely indifferent to human comfort. There are no guardrails, no convenient paths, and often no certainty about what lies ahead. The sense of risk and exploration is very real. What makes these modern explorations so compelling is that they reveal something fundamental about human nature. We are drawn to forgotten places. We are fascinated by mysteries hidden beneath the surface. Whether it's a sealed tunnel beneath an abandoned hospital, a cave passage that disappears in the darkness, or the ruins of a long-dead civilization, there is something deeply compelling when venturing into the unknown and seeing what awaits there. That desire is not something role-playing games invented. It's something they tap into. And perhaps that's the strongest argument of all. The dungeon endures because it speaks to a very real human impulse. The desire to explore and the thrill of discovery. Open a door, shine a light into the darkness, and see what has been unseen in years. Whether the place is an ancient underground city in Turkey, a forgotten necropolis beneath the sands of Egypt, a sprawling cave system beneath the mountain range, or a ruined fortress inhabited by goblins and giant spiders, the appeal is fundamentally the same. But the dungeon is not merely a place of adventure. It is where we come face to face with the lives that came before, lives with their own ambitions, triumphs, and failures. Every ruined city, forgotten tunnel, and abandoned hall reminds us that even the grandest works of humanity are eventually claimed by the sands of time, and a human lifetime is but a flicker in the hollowed halls of eternity. What was once vibrant and full of life eventually becomes an abandoned memory. Perhaps that is why these places captivate us so deeply. They are not just relics of the past, but quiet reminders of our own impermanence. And in the silence of those forgotten places, we are left to ponder what stories will remain when we, too, are but mere footnotes in the pages of history. Now I'd like to hear from you. What's been your experience with dungeons in your own games? Do you lean into the idea of them as living, evolving environments? Or are they more traditional, room-by-room challenges at your table? Have you ever run or played in a dungeon that really felt like a believable place with its own logic and history? Drop your thoughts and stories into the comments below. I love to hear how you approach it in your games. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you found this video fun and useful. I do think I owe a lot of you a brief explanation for my long absence. Honestly, it's not just one thing. Yeah, I was a bit annoyed at the view numbers for my last video, but it was more than that. I'd say there's a bit of fatigue from over a decade of reviews. The videos that I've really come to enjoy doing lately are videos like this one, where I do an essay on my thoughts on the game and its various aspects, but typically it's hit or miss. Some do well, others not so much. But my reviews videos seem to do the best. I'm hoping that this one does well, as I put a lot of time and research into it, and I have a lot of ideas for other such discussions. Anyway, thank you to all of my patrons, the few that remain, and who continue to support the channel month after month. Thank you so much. Please give this video a like, comment, and share. Join the channel's Facebook page, RPG Retro Reviews, and consider supporting the channel by becoming a patron yourself. Or alternatively, you can just send a tip through the PayPal tip jar or use Super Thanks. Links are in the description. And as always, my friends, may your D20 roll true and game on.